Okay. All right. As I told you, I'm a novice at this. So, all right. So first of all, I want to just quickly introduce our two guest presenters today. Most of you already know them. You've probably seen them around our church. The first is Mark Elder, who is a member of Fairlington United Methodist Church. He has been a fearless, dedicated worker with the Reconciling Ministry Network and spent a lot of time at our church when we were becoming a Reconciling Ministry church. And he's been integral not only with us, but in other churches in making that journey. He's also a delegate to the General Conference. So he's been in on a lot of the ins and outs of the decision making. And the second one is Rob Vaughn. And Rob is the lead pastor at Community of Faith United Methodist Church in Herndon. And as you probably remember, he and Pastor Tracy went to the Congo how many years ago has that been? Several. And he's continued to work with that ministry, which we were very fortunate to have him on board with that. He's also a delegate to the General Conference. So with that, I would like to just turn it over to whoever, Rob. He said they're going to turn to tag team it. So give us some insight in, a lot has happened in the last 2.5 years. Year and a half, 2.5. Anyway, I'll turn it over to Rob and to Mark.
Probably a good spot. Welcome, folks. Good spot to begin is with an update on annual conference stuff. Mark just gave the report to his church this morning. So why don't we just kind of head down to the next slide and let Mark begin to catch us up.
Sure, I can do that. Obviously, a big part of annual conference is worship. And what I told my congregation this morning was we have 3 big worship services during annual conference. One is an ordination service, one is a retirement service, and one is a remembrance service. And on Friday night, on June 18th, was the conference ordination service, and we ordained or commissioned 52 individuals, either as elders in full connection, licensed local pastors, or deacons. At the retirement service, there were 55 people that were recognized who were retiring. Together, they have served the conference for a total of 1,225 years worth of ministry collectively between that group of pastors who are retiring. And then at the remembrance service, there were 55 pastors or their spouses and 7 laity who were honored and remembered who had passed away in the last year. So that's a really rich part of annual conference experiences, those services and the music and the liturgy that goes along with those. I'm going to just spend most of my time talking a little bit about some of the business that went on Friday the 18th. There was a lot of focus during annual conference this year on transparency, particularly transparency as it relates to conference spending. There were 3 major motions that I wanted to just share with you that passed at annual conference, all related to spending issues. As a reminder to everybody in the Methodist system, all of our local churches pay apportionments. Those apportionments support the structure of the denomination. That includes the annual conference and things like the bishop's salary and our conference offices, but also supports our pastors' pensions, their health benefits, things like that. So we all have a stake in how our money is being spent. These 3 motions that I'm going to describe all passed by supermajorities. In fact, I think a couple of them passed as close to about an 80% margin. The first one had to do with conference legal expenses. My church, Fairlington, sent a letter at the beginning of June to the conference treasurer asking for some transparency and accountability around conference legal expenses. They have grown tremendously in the last 4 years. They used to average around 30 to 40,000 a year. Those expenses in the last year grew up to nearly $500,000. So that's a 10-fold plus increase in legal expenses. So one of the motions that was put forward by my pastor, Pastor Janine Howard, that passed was to create an oversight committee for conference legal expenses. And that group is going to look at the contract for our chancellor, which is another name for general counsel, and also some enforcement measures related to legal spending, all in an effort to bring some accountability around that spending area. And that committee is supposed to report back in 90 days. Another major motion that passed had to do with staffing in our district offices. So the Virginia Conference has 16 district offices. They're going to be reducing that to 8. We won't take action on doing that until next year. In the meantime, conference staff and the bishop and others put forward a plan that included money in the budget that we were voting on at annual conference to finance some new staffing in these reduced number of district offices. Some of that staffing would be mandated, and there were issues and concerns around who would manage those staff. Would they be managed out of the Richmond conference office or out of the district offices, which is how things typically work. Given that we aren't going to officially reduce the number of districts from 16 to 8 until next year, there was a motion at annual conference to strip out and remove the spending on these new district staff people until we can have a more formal plan about the streamlining of the districts a year from now. And that passed as well. One thing that was interesting that I pointed out to my congregation this morning is that streamlining the number of districts, that's happening in a lot of conferences in the Methodist system across the country, makes a lot of sense. It will save money. However, paired with this plan to mandate certain staffing in the reduced number of districts, it actually was going to end up costing more than what we spend now on the existing district structure. So wanted to note that. And then another thing I'll tell you is that Sarah Calvert, even though we're not going to officially reduce the number of districts starting in July next month, district superintendents will be overseeing 2 districts. So Sarah Calvert will be the district superintendent for both the Arlington and the Alexandria districts. And then the last motion that I wanted to highlight that we passed at annual conference relates to getting better information from our conference council on finance and administration. One piece of the motion that passed would require that body, if they make projections out into the future on spending on certain ministries or apportionment lines, they're required now to share that information verbally and in writing with the annual conference body. The other part of that motion was that if an apportionment line in our conference budget in a given year is going to grow by 10% or more, or change by 10% or more, that information must be shared and approved by the annual conference body. So that gets at the issue I mentioned with legal expenses, so that we have some check if we're seeing a line grow like that line was growing, but also the converse, because another thing that was discussed, but there was no action taken on it. We have money from our conference that supports our campus ministries across all the universities in the state of Virginia. And that line's been decreasing by a pretty significant amount over the last few years. And there's been concern about that too. So this motion that we passed requiring information when budget lines change by 10% or more will bring a little bit more transparency to what's happening in the budget. So those were the main motions that passed. The only other thing I'll mention just briefly, and Rob, I think I did describe for my congregation the declaratory decision and what happened on that. I think I might have you do that since you are so intimately familiar with that. But the other thing I just noted to my congregation this morning was that the theme of the conference, which was United as One. And I talked a little bit about our conference lay leader, Martha Stokes, who did a lay address. And she emphasized during that address, quote, "None of us are disposable in the body of Christ," unquote. And she talked a little bit about work that's going on in the conference to change and rethink what it means for clergy and laity to be called into ministry, and also talked a little bit about work that's being done on issues related to racial justice and reconciliation. And then Bishop Lewis, who closed out the morning worship on Saturday, recognizing that we do have a lot of theological differences within the conference. She emphasized the importance of unity over uniformity, and talked about that despite our differences on things, that quote, we can agree on, what we can agree on is Jesus, and that Jesus died for us to be reconciled, unquote. So I'm going to stop there and maybe let Rob talk a little bit about the declaratory decision, if that's okay.
Thanks, Mark. One of the pieces that's interesting, just responding to Mark's characterization of the bishop's sermon on Saturday, of the 5 major proposals that were in the business session, they were all defeated by 78 to 80%. So there's quite a bit of unity in terms of direction and the delegates wanted the conference to go to. So let me say a couple of words about RMN concerns. Virginia has 2 complaints active right now against clergy for having done same-gender weddings. We noted there were, I can't remember the chronology of when we were together with the centenary in Richmond. If it was right before the second one came or not, but we have 2 active. It's kind of curious if you subscribe to the Good News publications this past week. Tom Lambrecht of Good News. Good News is one of their subtitle is Forum for Scriptural Christianity within the United Methodist Church. They essentially are one of the birth parents of the new Global Methodist movement, which is our traditionalist spinoff of a new denomination. Let me quote to you. He says, since the introduction of the protocols in January 2020, traditionalists have scrupulously avoided filing complaints over pastors who perform same-sex weddings or non-celibate gays and lesbians ordained as clergy. This is his language. We have sought to maintain a truce in the conflict as we await the opportunity to move forward in a healthier direction following the 22 General Conference. I had a feeling that he's just completely oblivious to Virginia, or I'm not sure what that says about our Virginia Episcopal leader. But nevertheless, we have 2 here. We have the only bishop who has publicly said that she would not offer abeyance to clergy who do same-gender services. And thus we are moving past the supervisory area, which is kind of the process if somebody has a complaint, into the beginning of the formal trial phase, which has as its end product a formal trial for both clergy. During what Mark didn't tell you is in the clergy session, there are a clergy executive session that occurs at an annual conference session. Pretty much matters clergy in-house stuff. We receive new clergy persons, receive the report of the Board of Ordained Ministry, which acts as our vetting agency to move folks into ministry. If there are folks who need to exit for a variety of reasons, it's the folks who do that. And so in that, we sought to put sought direction from our judicial council. So think of judicial council in our United Methodist structure as our Supreme Court. So there are 2 ways you can send stuff to a judicial council. One is ask the bishop a question, and if you don't like their answer, ask them to have the judicial council review it. The other way is with declaratory decision. And essentially that is raised in one of 2 ways. There are asked 2 things. One, it comes up because an Episcopal leader has so egregiously not followed the discipline that you ask for clarification, or you're just not sure which way to go because the discipline doesn't give good guidance because it's ambiguous or because it just doesn't say. And so you ask the judicial council to tell us which way to go. Usually there's 2 or 3 that are asked from an annual conference to judicial council. Usually they're done by council of bishops or by sometimes annual conferences. And so we raised 11 points. And so what are some of the points like? So does accepting multiple complaints on a single person constitute double jeopardy? Is it right for a bishop to substitute or to seek out a complaint herself as opposed to just receiving a complaint? So these are really points of church law, but there's a lot of them. So one of the controversies was Bishop did not handle it well in the clergy session. Persons asked about it in the annual conference session. She handled it even worsely, misconstruing it as not as a declaratory decision, which is something that goes in one pathway, but as a bishop's ruling of law, which is not at all what it is. And so that just provided a lot more confusion and contention from folks. The good news is it was sent anyway and is now in the hands of Judicial Council, and we'll hear about their receipt this coming week. If it's fully accepted, then come in October, it'll be on their docket. And then sometime in November, we'll have rulings from them on the 11 points that were asked. So that's one big piece relating to marriage and ministry that came out of this annual conference. We may be still seeing more complaints that might emerge. Our Episcopal leader is not shy about staking out her persona as one who seeks to prosecute any clergy that does stuff she disagrees with. In our connection, there are other bishops who have privately said they would process a complaint, but they also have said, we'll never publicly say that. So something unique about Virginia, and certainly something Tom Lombrick and our friends in the traditionalist perspective don't seem to acknowledge. There is one piece it's probably worthwhile for Mark to comment on, and that's the hopes for this fall. Mark, would you say something about a fall gathering?
Sure. Yeah, we've talked and within Fairlington, there was some interest from my leadership, and I've talked to Rob about it, about having a gathering of reconciling Methodists in the Virginia Conference in this fall. We're working on planning that now. Probably will be late October or sometime in November before that occurs, and we're still working on location and that kind of thing. But we thought it coming out of the pandemic, this might be a good time to bring folks interested in a more inclusive church together. I know in my church, and I've heard from other churches, this stagnation, this morass we've been stuck in for the last 2 years because of the pandemic, and not making any progress on any definitive decisions coming out of General Conference has really frustrated many people. It's created lots of uncertainty. So we thought this fall, hopefully people will feel more comfortable coming together again in person, and that might be a good time to bring us together and talk a little bit about where things stand with respect to a future denomination that's more inclusive and welcoming. And we definitely want to use part of that gathering to be forward thinking, not just reporting out what's happening right now, but also forward thinking. We're also considering whether we can do the gathering jointly with reconciling folks from the Baltimore-Washington Conference as well. So stay tuned, more information will be coming about that gathering.
Great. Let's ask our slide person, if you advance to the next slide. Thing that you're aware of was last May, we were supposed to have General Conference. That didn't happen because of COVID. Then it got bumped to what would have been 2 months from now. And that didn't happen. So now we are here in August to September 2022 and praying for this to be able to happen. There is still a pocket of folks deeply concerned about the validity of it being able to be at this time. The reason is we're a global body. You know that. But as a global body, the places where Tracy and I have been to, both a number of years ago, and then I was at right before COVID back in January last year, in the DRC and other parts of Africa, vaccine is just not there and hardly beginning in many parts. So the concerns are, can enough infrastructure be created for our delegates who are global delegates, particularly our global delegates from Africa, to be able to be vaccinated? The other complication is what we have learned is once our embassies open back up, there is a huge backlog of cases. So those double concerns of being able to process visas to get folks to the US and get folks vaccinated enough are two challenges to being able to keep the General Conference on time. General Conference has to occur before jurisdictional conference. Jurisdictional conference is what populates our boards and agencies, but most important is also what where we elect bishops and assign bishops for the future. Really a significant thing for Virginia. Can we hit the next slide, please? I want to say a little bit about some of the issues for General Conference. And if our slide person could just kind of roll one more, that will tell you what some of them, come back one if you would. There you go. There you go. So that's a little bit about the general and jurisdictional delays. You can't have a jurisdictional until a general happens, with one big exception. Bishops can call for one with only a limited agenda. We had hoped maybe they would be able to call for one. A bunch of legal beagles have said, no, you really can't do the election. We are going to have a virtual jurisdictional conference in a few weeks, but it's for the limited vote of allowing two of our annual conferences that have been working on merger to finally merge. But that's all that can be done. So the rest of that business has to wait until after General Conference meets. There are two big things. We have chatted back in January when we met, or whenever it was, about the protocol of reconciliation and grace through separation. The momentum for that seems to have waned quite a bit. The leadership for it is of great concern. One of the African lead died in a car accident in January. The head of the board of discipleship died also this January after very sudden and debilitating illness with cancer that moved really rapidly. So while there is still much to bless the church with through that, what has achieved more momentum has been the Christmas covenant. Christmas covenant, as you remember, is a sourced globally with strong input from Africa, the Philippines, and the US. It essentially is to establish that one of our United Methodist bodies are a connectional table. Think of connectional table as what it's to the denomination as your at Clarington administrative council. Is that what you call it, Tracy? Your administrative council is to Clarendon. So this body, along with a global group of folks, have put forth a plan for regionalization. And what that means is the US would be one region with its own, not totally independent, but far more independent than we have now, ability to set social policy and things that are more appropriate and germane to the United States, thus allowing other regions to be able to do things that are more appropriate to their region. So what it means for us is we'd be able to get rid of some hostile language that is in the social principle statement, is the big concern for RMN communities. When General Conference meets, there's great sense that this will probably, I believe, will be passed. There's a great desire from those in the traditionalist camp to finally separate, let them go their way and find a way to go their way with their property. And so whether the protocol becomes dominant again, there's, I think, a very certain move to find some move toward regionalization or a new understanding of what United Methodism is about. Hard part is we got to meet in order to do that. So that's probably the big questions, the big stuff coming up at the moment. Mark, anything to comment on with that?
No, just to remind folks about the unusual structure we have today, wherein some parts of our global denomination already have the ability to contextualize some social policies, whether that be in Africa or Europe or the Philippines. It's just the structure of our discipline does not allow that to happen in the United States. That's why this regionalization concept is so important, to put us on par with our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. And Rob, I don't know if you have the answer. I know I've asked as a kind of a newly minted General Conference delegate, well, how did that come to be? How did it come to be that the United States can't contextualize some social policies in our own borders? And I haven't really found anybody who has a really good answer. But anyway, it is a big problem on some of the social policy, including LGBTQ inclusiveness, but other issues as well around race and women and others.
What that means is the United States needs to have the vote of the whole body, folks in Europe, Philippines, Africa, in order to make changes. But folks in other contexts like Africa or Northern Europe don't necessarily need the US to do that. But the explanation is far deeper than we'd want to do at this moment. Maybe it's worthwhile just taking a pause at this point before moving on with other conversation to see if there are questions about anything Mark or I have brought up, or questions that you would have about expectations and in our conferences moving forward.
Jane, have there been any questions on chat yet?
I have to unmute myself. Forget about that. Not yet. I haven't had any questions. So I think it's, is anybody have anything right now that they can think of regarding what we've talked about so far? I would ask this question. I have heard that there is a more very progressive group of United Methodists who have also talked about leaving the mother church, the Libertarian Connects. Can you expound about that? Or is that doesn't seem to be as for sure as the traditionalist?
Mark, you want to comment or?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I was muted. I didn't realize I was. But yes, there is a group called Liberation Methodist Connection, spelled CONNEXION. They announced their desire to form a new denomination in November of 2020. And that group is rooted in a liberation theology, liberating the poor and oppressed, no doctrinal litmus tests. It's targeting marginalized people, including people of color, LGBTQ people, those who are incarcerated, those with mental health or substance abuse issues, and others. And they do want to keep connection with the United Methodist Church, particularly with our racial and ethnic caucuses. And one thing I've learned when I was studying this group, the spelling of connection is based on the British spelling of the word during the time of John Wesley. Now, I think you're right, Jane, that group is not nearly as organized and certainly not as resourced as the Wesley Covenant Association. So I don't know how far along they are in their planning, but yes, that group does exist and announced their intentions in November.
Being a pretty relatively small meeting, less than 20 congregations last I noted and chatted with folks. In the often traditionalist conversation, how many churches are leaving kind of thing, we as a delegation asked the bishop, who was intimating a fairly robust number in one of our meetings, and pinned her down to say, so how many are you talking about, less than 10? And at that point, this was February of this year, only 4 churches that were engaged in conversations with the cabinet about disuniting. So Virginia is a very small number of folks, mostly family chapel kind of churches. There are only really maybe one church of size that is in that maybe disaffiliate segment. We certainly don't have the kind of desire for disaffiliation that you see in South Georgia or what's making the news at the moment in North Georgia. We are seeing some activism for that quite a bit, trying to drive a wedge in some of the Korean United Methodist churches, and trying to find other wedges so that the global Methodists might increase their number of churches seeking to affiliate with them.
Can you say something about, just help us to know a little bit more about the Global Methodist Church as it's being founded? I think they had written instead of a book of discipline, it was a book of doctrine and discipline. Am I right about that? That was their foundational.
It is. They've taken what we have and copied that. They don't have the robust belief in the episcopacy that we have. There's a lot more independence and autonomy in local churches. There is their own doctrine theologically. It is very traditionalist in issues of sexuality, since that's a concern of which we gather this afternoon. I really would prefer them to characterize themselves. Their great desire from folks who populate that is to be able to separate with their property, which is why the protocol was so important. It provided for what was believed then to be an easy way out, to sort of take your toys and leave with all of them. The big uncertainty in sort of what may happen institutionally is where will particular annual conferences in Africa and some of the Philippines go? Will they affiliate with another group? The difficulty is, one difficulty is purely money. 98% of the money that sustains the church in Africa comes from the United States. Well, 97, a couple of percent that comes out of Europe. And the global Methodist crowd does not have the robust depth to be able, our peers, not to have the robust depth to be able to sustain the current financial underpinnings that churches in Africa are used to at the moment. So that becomes.
Hey, I'm on the phone. Come on, what you need? Hold on. Mike's here and he needs flowers.
Maybe,
Remember Mike next door? Say hello.
Mike, I think you need to.
Hi, Barb.
Mike, you need to mute.
Yeah, hi there. How you doing? I'm doing great. Thanks. How are you?
Mike,
Please mute.
can you mute from as the person who is sponsoring or hosting the?
I think they got muted, maybe.
Okay.
The blessings of Zoom. So we'll have, so that's one of the dynamics about sort of future affiliation. One of the other elements that's been developing, many thought there are certain conferences which would definitely become a global Methodist affiliated conference. Read that as before Wesley Covenant Association, which then morphed into this new denomination. That's their new name. Places like South Georgia, friends of mine there who have said, we thought so-and-so churches, and they would name several. And as we get closer to General Conference, say, really leaving your friends, leaving the denomination that bore you and has meant so much, not really sure want to do that. So there's been some stepping back from churches that had been assumed to affiliate with a new denomination. So those are that's kind of the waterfront at the moment. But the other piece is significant. In the Southeast, we still carry 69%, we meaning progressive voices that are fully behind LGBTQIA inclusion. 69% of all delegates in the SEJ, the Southeastern jurisdiction, are committed to full inclusion. So the longer things may delay, the more dangerous it may become to erode some of those persons by folks dying, leaving, or saying, we want a whole new delegation. That's only been tried and unsuccessfully in one annual conference, and they've been able to maintain their current elected folks. There's not been a real move in the future for that, but that's always been kind of a lingering concern. We want to take advantage of the huge response that came after General Conference 19 that elected a very strong, very pro-inclusive hunk of delegates. So that's kind of some of the waterfront.
Yeah, Tracy, I'll add just a couple of things that when I was researching where the Wesley Covenant Association is right now, they have had a transitional leadership council in place since March of 2020, working on adopting governing documents. They're working on their own version of a book of discipline. They're working on issues around sacraments, church property, health insurance, pensions, just the whole required infrastructure to create a new denomination. And also in December of 2020, they did elect a new executive team. They have a structure of a 27-member council and global legislative assembly that has been formed that preceded the announcement of their name. So they've been very busy during the pandemic getting their governing documents in order.
And is there information about the level of involvement and connection of churches or conferences beyond the United States, Africa, the Philippines, Europe, etc., with the Global Methodist Church? Do we have a sense of how many churches or conferences might be interested in departing from the United Methodist?
That's the big question. That's the $1 million question. Right. There are some bishops that have been as bold as the bishop in the Central Congo Episcopal area, who have said folks who affiliate with this new Methodist church are no longer Methodist and shouldn't be considered Methodist, and has been very strong in terms of his beliefs on where folks ought to move.
And friends, that's the conference that we are connected with through Wings of Caring.
That's correct. That's correct. However, there have been others who are on the other who's on the other end, who believe that they ought to affiliate differently. The big question is, when the time comes, where will folks eventually move to, and will they?
Right.
So I have a question from someone, which goes back to our situation here in Virginia. Two actually questions. One is, did I understand you to say that our current bishop is taking a hard line on the issue of punishing pastors who conduct same-sex marriage, as well as pastors who are in same-sex relationships?
Yes.
So down.
The punishment at the moment, or the move now, is not past gay pastors. It's about pastors who are doing weddings for same-sex individuals. The move into a judicial phase of this whole process is one that's significant, because as you remember, in 2019, the traditional plan was passed. And so if a pastor says, yep, I did it, then there is not supposed to be anything other than an automatic sentence. So think about a DUI. First offense, this is what you get. You don't let judges do what we ask judges to do, is determine, look and weigh all the pros and cons. They have to do first offense, this is what happens. So same way here, if this is a pastor's first time, the required minimum sentencing is 1 year unpaid suspension. Minimum, not maximum, minimum. If a pastor does it a second time, then they are fully separated from the church. And there's no discretion given to the trial court, which is what occurs if there's any other kind of trial for any other kind of chargeable offense.
So just so you hear that again a little bit, sometimes hearing that in a second way makes it that much clearer. If there were a circumstance of misbehavior on the part of a clergy person that would be serious enough to lead to trial. So you can imagine, with the kinds of conversations happening around the world regarding situations in church life that have been very seriously damaging, very deeply wounding things that have happened as a result of misconduct on the part of clergy. Those are given full, those are treated as responded to in the way that the discipline has always worked. So, it's a trial with all of the checks and balances in place and so forth. But just in this one area of same gender weddings, there is a completely different approach. And no discretion, and much more harsh than any of the other things that might come before a court or trial.
Adding to that, just as an add-on, the rest of the Council of Bishops recognize that we're in a liminal time, that the expectation is that General Conference, when it does meet, will change that. We'll adopt some kind of regional approach, and we'll surely get rid of that language. So we know that's going to happen. So the Council of Bishops has recommended that all bishops adopt a posture of abeyance. Any complaints they get, they just set it aside until General Conference occurs. And if what's expected occurs as expected, then there will no longer be an offense. Our bishop in Virginia has refused to acknowledge that ask of abeyance. That's why things are different in Virginia.
And she is the only bishop in the denomination to do so.
I wanted to accentuate what Tracy said about the punishment for this officiating at a wedding. Think about it. You have pastors who might sexually harass somebody, rape somebody, abuse a child. And this rule is saying that those offenses can go through the normal just resolution process that was in the discipline before the traditional plan was passed. But officiating at a wedding of two people of the same gender gets a harsher punishment. I mean, just think about that disconnect in terms of the severity of the action. I just think it's just very striking. The other thing I wanted to note is that one of the pastors under complaint right now, the wedding that he officiated at occurred before the traditional plan took effect. So I think that's correct, right, Rob? So he's, I think, under a different set of rules because of that.
And then the follow-up to that is we actually have one pastor who was under direct employment. It was a direct report to the bishop, who didn't do a same gender wedding, but actually attended one and was in the wedding party, wanting not to be a part of, thinking that it being the officiant would not be appropriate for her because of her job. Lost her job because she just happened to be in attendance and in the wedding party. So there's part of the context of being in Virginia at the moment.
It's a time when morale is quite low. I've been in ministry in Virginia or been a layperson in committed leadership for since the 1970s, and I have never experienced anything like the morale. It's really low.
When our current bishop arrived early on in the first few months of her tenure, she did meet with representatives from the reconciling movement. And in that session, I concretely remember her saying that there were allowable actions that a pastor could take with respect to a wedding of a same gender couple. And that included attending, for sure. Reading scripture. Maybe, I think she even said that counseling a couple would be okay. She just didn't want them officiating, didn't want them signing the marriage license and all that. So this action against the person who attended a wedding is in great contrast with what she said when she first arrived.
So another question that came up was at a meeting we had with Centenary United Methodist in Richmond. It was a reconciling ministry church meeting. There was a plan for that church to meet with the bishop, a group from that church meet with the bishop. Did anything come of that, or do you know of anything coming of that?
They did. They had a meeting with their layperson and their pastor. But in terms of any reportable outcome that would be different from what we've already shared, there wasn't. So there was receptivity to hear their angst and concern.
Okay, is there anybody else who has any other questions? So we are right at the 1 hour mark. Do we want to, how do you want to proceed?
So Jane, let me just offer a couple of things. Mark intimated this as in his opening remarks as well. Let me invite you to, whoever has the slides, to go to the next one for a moment. And just help understand the posture of the conversation in the days ahead. One of the parts about being a reconciling church is certainly the importance of seeking inclusion and intentional ministry with the GLBTQIA community. Having done that and gone through that process, there's a lot of intersectionality that we have confronted, certainly in the last year, with racial justice. And there's also intersectionality with lots of other populations who have not always been loved by the church. Pretty appropriate. If you were doing the lectionary today, was a wonderful passage in Mark 5 on healing. So think about all the places that need healing. Folks who may live with different challenges to mental health or different kind of physical challenges. So as you look at what inclusion means in even a broader intentional mode, and at this liminal time in our denomination's history, as we sort of release our traditionalist sisters and brothers to maintain the kind of purity that they are seeking in institutional life, who do we seek to become? Folks who believe in God's liberating and freeing justice for all. One of the questions, what's the vision of God's church we seek to be in Virginia? We've been chatting with our folks in our general conference delegation and our jurisdictional delegation, begin to think together and invite you at Clarington to think as well. Who do we seek to become as United Methodists? Because we have a chance to form and identify what is this new incarnation of United Methodist Church, not just to go back to the way things were, but who we want to be and become, led by churches who are bold enough to say, we seek to be inclusive of all folks. Some of the questions that our delegation is going to be looking at, let me invite you to roll to the next slide, are these. Things like, how would a future UMC reflect its rich heritage of Wesleyan Christian theology, spiritual practice, and unique emphasis? How do we assure all persons that they are welcome, respected, and included in a future UMC, including those who currently are excluded and those who may want to leave, feeling there is no place for them? So our folks who are, think of sort of centrists, not quite at the place of saying, I think this is a wedding I would be willing to do, but I want to be in a church where that's okay, even if I'm not. Is there a place for me? So that's one of those questions. Hit the next slide, if you would, roll ahead, and we'll look at the other two. Is there anything about our existing life that needs to be maintained in order to step into the future that we prefer? Or what are some of those key essential changes that would be required for us to do that, to move into a preferred future, both in our annual conference, our global organization, and our local church? And given that everything's possible, is significantly easier, thinking in theory than in actual lives, what are we willing to give up in order to move into the church that we think Christ is calling us to become? So these are some of the questions that we'll be working on as a delegation, not just saying, we against this thing, but this is who we want to be and who we're wanting to move forward as we seek to mold a new incarnation of United Methodist belief. We put these questions out before you because they're the ones we'll be in dialogue about for you to consider for your conversational starters as well.
Mark, do you have any other closing comments or thoughts?
Well, I guess I will say something that I've said once in a while. As a gay delegate to General Conference, I do believe, as I become a delegate and been doing the research and study, I really do feel that my constituency is being a little scapegoated, because one thing that's become very clear to me, I feel like the focus on LGBTQ inclusion is a mask to avoid dealing with some other issues that have our denomination struggled with for a long time, particularly related to race, but also related to women in the church. My mother was a minister in the church. She had a hard time in her ministry being assigned to small churches in central Illinois. So there are other struggles that we've had for decades, and I do feel scapegoated, I have to say. And that's become, I didn't necessarily feel that way specifically when I became a General Conference delegate, but as I've learned, I feel that very strongly. That, this idea that we might split over who I am is very unfair, given some long-standing structural and other issues that the church faces.
Thank you for that honest and forthright answer. Does anybody else have any other questions or thoughts before we close out here? Someone had asked when this recording will be posted, and I'm assuming I can send it to Tanya, and she can do magic in posting it. So I could assume that it would be next week. We will have it posted. So, and I'm sure she'll let everybody know that too.
Can I say that I would like to be sure that our two General Conference delegates, Rob and Mark, hear from us our deep gratefulness for the amount of work and heart and prayer and passion that you have, that has been required of you in order to be General Conference delegates, and particularly in this liminal time when the landscape shifts and changes, sometimes on an hourly basis, depending on how close you are to annual conference starting, or some of these other dramas that have unfolded. But you're required in this work to keep up with a lot of information, a lot of reading, a lot of connecting. And it, knowing you, it is an act of deep faith and love for the church and love for God's people. And I know personally I'm grateful, and I know we as a congregation are grateful for the ways in which you are offering yourselves, along with the entire group that, the elected group from Virginia. We're just really deeply grateful. And some of the work that you've been doing is really pivotal for us. And it's just deep gratitude.
Thank you. Let me just offer two notes. One, Mark and I would be happy to hang out for a little while once, if folks want to get more in the weeds or have more questions that you'd like to explore once Jane sort of formally concludes. But also just an important element to echo Mark's word. As you know, this is far deeper than issues of sexuality. The concerns that have, ever since the late 1960s, the folks who have borne Genesis to Good News and the groups which are organizing Departure have been organizing around issues of race, gender, women in leadership, and a whole host of issues of understanding the authority of Scripture, the role of bishops in our lives together. This isn't new stuff. It's been going on for quite a while. And just to say, and echo Mark's word, the concerns are far deeper, and the rift is far more than the scapegoating that Mark alludes to. Which is why conversations about this, conversations that finally got taken more seriously last spring about racial injustice, are so important in our faith community. So just to say, yeah, you guys who are having conversation like this tonight, and having serious conversations about issues of white privilege and racism, and all the other deep issues that give rise. If we can't do that in a faith community, where else are we going to be able to do it? So thank you for your invitation to us. We're deeply grateful for being able to be a part of a faith community that wrestles with serious questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your candor and your just honesty. We appreciate it. So thank you for offering. I don't know if I'm happy to continue hosting if there are people who might want to stay on and continue the conversation. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Tracy if she will pray us out, and then those who want to stay or be happy for you to stay on. And again, thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so much, Mark, for taking this time and for being so honest and forthright about what's going on and about your own situation. So anyway, Tracy, can I ask you to pray us?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's join in prayer. Holy God, we thank you for the gift of this day, for the gift of this gathering, and for the gift of those who have come to us to offer us information, enlightenment, understanding. Your grace is at work in our lives and in our communal life together. We pray for the United Methodist Church, for a people who have sought to bear your good news in the world from the 60s, but of course in our previous life before that time as well. We thank you for the gift that is this community of faith, the Wesleyan movement, now known as United Methodism. We pray that your guidance will be with us in the days and weeks and months ahead, in the years ahead, as we discern your wisdom and guidance as we seek a path ahead. Bless us on this day as we go forth, that we may continue to be your people and live out our call in this world you love. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. So should I stop recording now?
Yeah, that sounds good.